Pop quiz. Who do you think is, in terms of win rate, the best god in Smite right now? Is it maybe still Arachne? Is it maybe the goddess of demonetization? Is it maybe Loki, and because you think that you're one of the 5 people still playing Loki? Well, it's none of them. And maybe you knew it, maybe you're also following on Twitter and you already knew it from there, but I was thoroughly impressed when I found out who the best god in Smite is. We're gonna start with the least obvious one being Arena. So we have a list of 4 gods here that could be in the running: Khepri, Xingtian, Odin, and Kukulkan. And then we continue to Assault, and now it should be clear already. The only one that reappears here in the top 2 is Kukulkan, only a Porsche in front of him, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. And Kukulkan's win rate, despite not being a healer count, is almost the same. Hardly any difference, 2% at this point. In Joust, he is number 1 in terms of win rate. In Clash, he's the 2nd in terms of win rate. In Siege, he's the 1st in terms of win rate. And in Conquest, he is also the 1st. Kukulkan is, without a doubt, statistically the best god in any casual mode at the moment. And that is pretty insane to me. And this is not because this includes super new players either. All these stats are just from games of level 30 onwards. And if that isn't a beautiful introduction to today's video, then I don't know what is. Because this god is actually insane right now, and we're gonna look into that from a numbers perspective. And there's some ridiculous going on that I've literally never seen on any god in Smite so far. Things that made me legitimately laugh out loud while looking at the numbers. And I'm typically not very entertained by numbers, but this was just too funny. So, like I said, all of these stats are from level 30 plus, and if you think the stats are just from new players or that these stats were always as high for Kukulkan, that's not the case. These are the stats from the current patch, and you can also see the improvement over last patch. So you can see that his win rate before that was 34th and is plus 33 slots up to number 1. His popularity also increased from spot 10 to spot number 5. His entire KDA across all matches improved by 1 on the kills, 1 less death, and 1 on the assists. It's absolutely fantastic. He's improved so much here. Oh, fantastic for Kukulkan players. Even his damage has increased by a drastic amount from 20,000 to 23,000 roughly. To put that in perspective, Ragin, who also got a buff that actually had a higher base damage increase and a little less scaling increase, but just 5% less but way more base damage on top, got roughly 1,000 extra damage and sits at roughly 18,500 damage now. To visualize this a little bit more, this is his performance throughout the recent patches from 6.6 to 6.11. You can see how he absolutely skyrockets in win rate in Conquest. And at the same time, you can see that his popularity in comparison didn't even increase that much. That might change a little bit more after this video and once it gets more known, but right now he's not even played that much more, considering that he's an absolute beast. A very entertaining detail is that the casualsmite.com site lists tips or like indications for all the gods, and this one reads as follows. Kukulkan approved best played in Assault with a 62.87% win rate and worst in Clash with a 55.94 win rate. Now keep in mind, he is the 2nd place in Clash out of all gods. That's his worst mode right now. Before we go into the necessity of this buff, or if it was even necessary, we should also look at ranked, because we have a bit of a different picture there from the last patch. That's because the stats for the current patch are not out yet on smite.gg. But we have those stats and they are very much in a different direction. So what we can see here is that his win rate actually dropped heavily in patch 6.10, and I don't think yet any changes or the patch brought any changes that were significantly relevant to that. There were some fixes to his tier 5 skin, so that's a little bit more obvious, so that may drop his win rate a little bit, but not that many people even play the tier 5 skin to begin with, so that shouldn't be the core factor here. What we can see here is that his win rate dropped to 44.94%, and it dropped by 7%. So before that, his performance in ranked was basically around the same as it was in casual before, roughly 52% win rate, which would be much more what we expect. So what happened here? His popularity went up by a lot, or his pick rate rather went up by a lot compared to before, by 4.27% to 710%. So it really was more than doubled overall. And I think that is because he was played in the SPL on the last patch already. It's quite common that when guards are played in competitive, that the ranked community will be the first ones to kind of pick that up, kind of copy that and see how it works in their games. And apparently it didn't work that well, and that's probably mostly because Kukulkan really needs a team that can defend him, and if he doesn't have that, he doesn't work nearly as well. Or used to work, at least on the last patch. So what happened for Kukulkan to be able to blow every other guard out of the water so easily in the current patch? Well, he got a massive buff. And this was basically a bunch of buffs that had accumulated over time, as we know now, because Hi-Rez didn't want to buff him surrounding his tier 5 release, because they didn't want to have a situation where people said he only got the buff because of his tier 5. Apparently he was basically due for a buff since January. That could of course be argued based on the fact that his win rate was relatively around the middle, and that he was now picked in the SPL, but before that he wasn't super popular, so I could have seen a buff happening at an earlier point. But instead we got a lot of it all at once, basically. So we got a base health increase from 365 to 380, a health per level increase from 68 to 75, and a movement speed increase from 355 to 360. And what we saw was that his death went down by 1 on average, and that's basically explained with this part. For the most part, of course, if you do more damage, you can also get less death from that. But this makes sense. These are the survivability aspects, and I think those were absolutely necessary as well. I think Kukulkan needed a bit more in return for not being as survivable in other ways as many other mages are. But the part where it gets more critical is the whirlwind buff, and I'm going to read that out in detail because I think a lot of people didn't quite catch what's in here. Increase the rate at which whirlwind attempts to apply or refresh the damage effect on a player in the area from every 0.5 seconds to every 0.25 seconds. This means from initial cast, it will now take 1.75 seconds for a player to be hit by a whirlwind dot, down from 2 seconds. That means it's easier to hit enemies with a whirlwind because it ticks quicker, and this is important. It will also more quickly refresh, increasing the chances the enemy will take additional ticks after leaving the area. And then the last line that apparently a lot of people didn't even notice: whirlwind now deals 1 additional tick of damage when first applied to an enemy. That means it just straight up does more damage every single time. That's a raw damage increase by 1 additional tick of base damage and 1 additional tick of scaling. And of course, I had to look into the numbers after reading this. And here they are. So we have a base damage of 50 at max rank of Kukulkan 3 and a scaling of 15% per tick. Now the minimum number of ticks that we can get if the enemy was in the tornado but then got out right away within 0.25 seconds, so basically it's like super at the edge of it, would be 5 ticks. The minimum base damage here would be 250 and the scaling would be 75%. I tested this against 2 power levels. One is 200 power where we had 400 damage. I explain why 200 power in a second. And the other one is a full build. That is a relatively, or a very conservative build, a very defensive build as such as well. That's kind of an one-size-fits-all build. It's Book of Thoth, Shoes of Focus, Spear of the Magus, Gem of Isolation, Polynomicon, and Obsidian Shard. So this works very well against tanks with a double shred. Often this is not even necessary. Often you could get like Book of the Dead or something. And it also has a Gem of Isolation for easier setup for yourself. So a very safe build overall, not very aggressive. And that's 750 power. And we can see that would be 812 damage here. 812 damage minimum is pretty heavy hitting for how this ability works now. Because while it has a bit of a wind up where you place it, you have to keep in mind that most other abilities have travel time, and that sometimes even makes them easier to juke. Sure, there are exceptions like Habois 3, but those are not the rule. Now keep in mind that most of the time you'll get hit by more ticks than that. You'll probably get hit because you're a little bit further towards the middle of the ability, and especially if the Kukulkan has Gem of Isolation, then you have a harder time getting out as well. So I would say at least 2 more ticks is realistic, if not more, and at this point we're talking close to 100, if not above 100% scaling. So what happens if somebody stands in the tornado for the full duration? Then we're talking about 650 base damage and 195% scaling. At 200 power, that is 1040 damage, and at 750 power, this is 2112 damage. And keep in mind that you have a super easy time getting to almost these damage numbers against many targets, because Kukulkan works so well with Spear of the Magus. If you have 12 ticks of something, then after 5 ticks it's fully stacked already, and that should shred through most protections. Now, the question is, how often will you actually get that many ticks? It's definitely not impossible if you have Gem of Isolation and if you have an ally that locks down the enemy afterwards, or if you follow up with your one right after, you can kind of lock them down longer. So it's not something that can't happen. I think at least 10 ticks is something that can be quite realistic in many situations. And this whole thing got buffed in multiple ways. On one hand, because the damage ticks earlier, Gem of Isolation should also proc earlier, because it's procs right at the start of the ability now, slowing you in the tornado itself longer. Additionally, it should work better against Aegis Amulet, because you now have less of a time frame where you're damage immune in relation to how long it ticks on you. It ticks for 2.5 seconds, starting from 0 seconds now, and Aegis only lasts for 1.5 seconds, so you should at least always take 2 ticks. And the funny thing to me is if we compare this to Kukulkan's ultimate, right? It's an ultimate, it has a super long cooldown and you use it to completely clean up. Kukulkan's ultimate has 800 base damage and 120% scaling. That means at 200 power, which is why I chose this number, it does the same damage as standing in a Kukulkan tornado for the full duration. Only that Kukulkan's tornado is back up again roughly 10 seconds later with a little of cooldown reduction. This coincidentally also happens to be Scylla's ultimate damage, so that puts us in perspective a little bit more. And it's additionally worth noting that 200 power is something that you achieve just by building Book of Thoth and Shoes of Focus without even having them fully stacked at that point. That furthermore means that you will reach these stats long before you hit level 20 and even have your ultimate maxed out, meaning around level 10-ish, Kukulkan's tornado can easily deal more damage if the enemy is locked down properly. And that is just crazy to me, how the 3 can really outshine the ultimate, of course, under the circumstances where enemies are locked down a little bit. But then again, for the ultimate, ideally you want to have enemies locked down as well, and the ultimate is easier to counter with Aegis as well. And when maxing it out, then Kukulkan's ultimate ends up at 1700 at 750 power, so significantly lower. But I also wanted to put it in perspective with some other mage dots, namely Shonquis and Anubis. In the case of Shonquis 1, we have 300 base damage and 75% scaling. That means at 200 power we deal 450 damage, so ever so slightly more than the minimum damage of Kukulkan's tornado. In most cases, Kukulkan's tornado will easily outdamage though, because Shonquis 1 cannot tick longer than this. Sure, you can chain it with his other abilities and stuff, but usually that lowers his damage more. And at 750 power, Shonquis' ability ends up at 862 damage, so again, very much to the low end of Kukulkan's tornado potential. Anubis is a bit of a different story. He is a higher damaging mage. Looking at his 3, he deals up to 340 damage with 140% scaling, which means 620 damage at 200 power, or up to 1390 damage at 750 power. Now the difference is that for that you have to stand in Anubis 3 for the full duration, whereas with Kukulkan, the ticks can still last after you leave it. Of course, Grasping Hands has a slow that can kind of offset that a little bit, but if you stand in both for a similar amount of time, then Kukulkan's ability will definitely deal more damage. But what about Anubis 1? Well, in case of Anubis 1, you have to stand in the ability itself, and it's at melee range, and he puts himself at very high risk. So it's a little bit more damage. It's 570 base and 240% scaling if you add it all together, which is something that Kukulkan's 3 can almost compete with when talking about lower amounts of power, but at very high amounts of power, Anubis 1 will outscale here. But it's not that easy. While Anubis hypothetically deals up to 2370 damage with his 1, whereas Kukulkan only deals 2112, there's one thing that we have to consider, and that is Spear of the Magus. Anubis 1 only has a total of 6 ticks. Kukulkan's 3, on the other hand, makes much better use of Spear of the Magus by maxing it out long before the ticks run out, because the ticks themselves deal lower damage over a longer amount of time. Now Anubis can offset that still, because he has his passive with more protection shred, so it's not like all is lost for him here and he would actually deal less damage, but just looking at the abilities isolated, Kukulkan's 3 is pretty damn close to Anubis 1 while being at a far range. So knowing that this ability has the potential to be stronger than Kukulkan's ultimate if you have a sufficient amount of lockdown, and even without that, is a very high damaging ability that will outdamage many other dots quite easily. And it's also super easy to place now. It's very hard actually to miss. You either place it in a zoning way and you basically miss on purpose just so enemies can't go somewhere, or you will probably land it on people significantly more often than you did before. I think Hi-Rez went a little bit overboard with this buff, as the stats overall indicate, and I can't even completely blame them for this one, because I think they weren't aware of how good Kukulkan could still be, as he only picked up in popularity in the SPL around the same time that they were already working on this change and basically finalizing the patch. So it's a little bit late to revert at that point, but now we have Kukulkan as an absolute monster with super easy to apply ticks that immediately tick, punishing you right away, and then ticking out for the same duration as before, but with that extra tick in total. And I think that's pretty scary, and I would not be surprised if we see Kukulkan at Worlds as well. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, please sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to click the like button. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.